And one of my colleagues on the Global Supply Chain Council thinks I'm being overly optimistic and should be making a 10-year horizon before we're looking at post-COVID. So even 2 to 5 years, which we think seems reasonable, thinks is optimistic.
This is Straight Talk in the COVID economy, and my name is Larry Quick. Our world has changed and there's no going back. The COVID economy is now very real. We are adapting to telework, Zooming, online learning and new industries like PanSafe and other opportunities revealed by COVID-19. The challenges are also with us: bankruptcies, unemployment, debt and confusion. In Straight Talk in the COVID economy, we meet thinkers and innovators who bring insight and information into the opportunities and risks of our rapidly emerging COVID economy. Straight Talk in the COVID economy is brought to you by Resilient Futures. This is alongside our partner, Impact Africa Network. Impact Africa Network is a non-profit startup studio in Nairobi on a mission to ensure young talented Africans have a chance at participating in the digital transformation of Africa as creators and owners. If grassroots change is something that excites you, visit www.impactafrica.network. By doing that, you'll be able to support, as donors and mentors, the Impact Africa Network.
Welcome back to Straight Talk in the COVID economy. My name is David Platt, and today I'm going to be taking the reins from Larry to bring you another critical conversation within the COVID economy. Today I'm chatting with Chris Miller, who I'll introduce more formally in just a moment. But before I do, I want to remind you to press subscribe on whichever platform you're listening on to make sure you're informed of future episodes of Straight Talk, and let us know your thoughts on today's conversation by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Based on my prior conversations with Chris, we're in for a very insightful discussion today. So now let's go to my chat with Chris. So for today's edition of Straight Talk in the COVID economy, I'd really like to make welcome our guest, Chris Miller, who's a member of our Resilient Futures Prime Network. And what we're doing today is really getting into what are some of our network members seeing as critical issues based on their area of work and expertise. So a bit of background about Chris. For the past 14 years, Chris has specialized in risk and business continuity management. She works in areas like supply chain, looks at dependencies and how you manage those interrelationships. She's worked with government, business and not-for-profits, and organizations ranging in size from 2 to more than 80,000 employees. She's worked in Australia and internationally, and prior to discovering business continuity management, or BCM, she's had careers in policing, emergency management, including areas such as pandemic planning and counterterrorism. So with that as a bit of background, I'd really like to make you welcome to Straight Talk in the COVID economy today, Chris. And I'll just kick to you as a first bit of further context setting. Maybe just tell us a bit more about that journey. Where did you start, and what are the sort of moments, if you like, that brought you to where you are today in terms of, getting down and focused on issues like pandemic, vaccine, et cetera, in the context of business continuity?
Thanks very much, David, and thank you for your listeners for tuning in today or later to enjoy these few remarks in this session together. Well, how did I come into all of this? That was a long time ago. Actually, in January, it'll be 50 years since
Fantastic.
Agency management as a volunteer, hanging off ropes and doing crazy search and rescue things, then becoming a police cadet, being tangled up in the 74 Brisbane floods, finding my way out of the response space into the planning and exercise space with counterterrorism, then moving into recovery for things like the Bali bombings, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and big ticket items. And then that brought me into the health space. In policing, I was involved with AIDS, HIV education, and a hepatitis B vaccination program. And I've since discovered more recently that it's actually very rare to find anyone that has worked on an adult vaccination program, because the majority of the programs are for children. Things like MMR, mumps, measles, mumps and rubella, polio, those kind of diseases which are, thankfully, and may they stay that way, unknown in Australia, but still can be a real problem in other countries. And supply chain was a logical development in the business continuity space. After the Indian Ocean tsunami, I was a bit of a crispy critter. I was a bit burnt out. I think 16-hour days, 7 days a week for weeks on end, wore even
Yeah.
energetic levels down.
Yeah.
And my deputy CEO at the time, Stephen, said, well, actually, I need someone to help me with my business continuity. And I sort of went, huh? What? What's that? He said, we'll give you a 3-month trial and see if you can make the transition from emergency management to business continuity. Well, of course, the joke's on me. In a few days' time, it'll be 15 years since I stumbled into business continuity.
Fantastic.
And since then, I've worked with some wonderful clients such as News Corp on the federal election, with some not-for-profits, with governments in the Commonwealth, ACT, and New South Wales government. I worked on PPE stockpiles, personal protective equipment stockpiles before COVID. I've worked on the AMPI, which is the Australian Health Management Plan for Pandemic Influenza, which has become the COVID response plan now.
Yes.
Tonight, in February, it had a new title and a bit of tweaking here and there. I didn't do it, but I was involved in some of the earlier versions when we dealt with it for the first round of SARS. We came back, dusted off our plans and had a bit of a look at them then to see if we could do better. And I was involved in some of the big health emergency exercises that we did in the OOs, Cumston and Sustain, to try and tweak some of those plans and make them better. Now, that's not to say we couldn't have been better again, but you might have noticed that Australia has perhaps fared better than some other countries. So maybe all that investment of effort that my colleagues and I put into trying to make those plans and trying to exercise those plans has paid some reward for the taxpayers now.
Yeah.
Perhaps in better condition.
A bit of a legacy from that work, at least the pre-thinking there to be accessed and as a baseline for what we had to do in a pretty short period of time.
Yes.
Yeah.
As I say, it's not to say we couldn't have done better, but it's pretty obvious when you compare the illness and mortality rates in Australia with countries that we would normally compare ourselves with. We haven't done too badly.
Yeah.
To underwrite, though, the sad loss of people's lives. Having been a police officer, I've been the unfortunate person to tell the next of kin that their loved ones have died. It's never a day. And see the devastation that it brings to many families very directly. So it's not to undersell the sadness of those we've lost, those who've got long COVID, and those who've had a pretty scary time in hospital trying to get well.
Yeah, absolutely. And before, and one of the reasons, as you know, that we've invited you to join us today is the deep expertise you have in that particular area and all the work that you've done and the thinking that you've done and the research that you've done. And we'll go into that in quite a bit more detail in a sec. But just before we do, can I ask you to just share a bit in terms of, in addition to COVID, what else is front of mind for you? What are you thinking about, either because of what COVID has revealed or in terms of what you were already seeing, some key issues to do with business continuity?
Well, I've always been a bit of a futurist, so it's hardly surprising that we sort of came together. I mean, more than 20 years ago, I was lecturing on policing futures at Charles Sturt University and hearing some of my policing colleagues about some of those ideas. So I've always had a bit of a future bent. And now, COVID environment, and even before COVID, a lot of people mistakenly think that business continuity is only about helping you in a crisis. It's actually about smoothing your business, the rough edges, the vulnerabilities, so that you're less likely to need your business continuity plan. And that's always been the case for me even before COVID. And now that we're moving into what you might call a COVID normal period, I'm inviting my colleagues and clients to look back at what did we leave behind, because we kind of ski jumped. I used to be a skier, ski jumped into COVID response. And I know I had to smile with some of my former clients who told me, no, we can't work remotely. No, we've got all these security protocols. No. And guess what? Yes, they are working remotely.
Yeah.
But then that raises the question, what did they leave behind? Did they tell their chief technical officer to just pull out all the security controls to make remote working possible? So I'm inviting them to look back at things that they may not have done a risk assessment on. Should recover some of those security controls? Did they leave behind important parts of their business that they didn't think they could move online or do remotely? Can we retrieve some of the good bits of the old days? Because, going back to business as usual pre-COVID, it'll be something else.
Mm-hmm.
And they're moving people into a settling down in the COVID normal period, but also being mindful that we'll have periods of outbreaks, as we've observed in South Australia. Things are very nice in South Australia, and then all of a sudden, they're not so good. Very quickly. We can expect that over a lengthy period of time. And the data, that matches the data from the 1918-19 pandemic, where they had periods of, they had a herald wave, a pandemic wave, a second wave, and then trailing waves. I did study epidemiology way back, the dark ages of my university career, a tiny bit, when I did a master's degree in applied sociology research methods. It was sort of an optional subject I took. And I do respect the people who make it as their living. They are just brilliant people. I've had the very good fortune to work with a couple of them, and they're just so clever. Instead of the talking head you're seeing now. So I won't finger them. They might not want to remember me.
But there is a point in that, though. And when we first met, you talked a bit about when you did some of that earlier work in the double O's, as you talk about the previous decade, and having done some of that historical work to see that pattern around 100-year pandemics, and then to start playing that forward. And that is a bit of the challenge, if you like, of being having foresight, is understanding that it's not all about what is ahead, but it's also being able to take relevant information from the past and interpret it into what it might tell us about the future. Just before we dive into the sort of pandemic at the moment, when you discovered that pattern, the 100-year pandemics, what did that get you to start thinking about?
Yes. So I get quite annoyed when people keep using that unhelpful phrase, black swan event. This is not a black swan event. If you have any sense of history, and there's a terrific infographic that Visual Capitalists have put up that have looked at the history of pandemics. This was coming. I distinctly remember when I was involved in writing AMPI with a former chief medical officer, that he was a man not known for overstating. He was a very evidence-based fellow.
Yeah.
Again, I won't name him because he mightn't wish to be connected with
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
But I distinctly remember he was in a large conference room in the Commonwealth Department of Health with about 100 people, maybe more, very large conference room. And these were the people involved in writing the AMPI, the Australian Health Management Plan for Pandemic Influenza. And he said very chillingly, we are not planning for if, we are planning for when. And those words have rung in my ears many times. He was so right. I wish he was wrong, but he was so right. And another thing that reminded me was that I've been reminded of is the 1918-19 pandemic. I got a bit tangled up with interviewing people. We actually interviewed some of the survivors.
Oh, right.
Of course, they were very young at the time, interviewing them. They were in their 90s. And I remember one gentleman, perhaps it was my too many years in the police, sort of looking a bit puzzled and saying, you seem to remember a lot of details very well, because it was a long time ago and you were very little. And he also chillingly swung around and said, if you lived through it, you'll never forget it.
Right. Yeah, I've got a bit of goosebumps there when you've said that. And
And I think that we will, those of us who survive 2020, spend the rest of our lives trying to forget it, or we'll never forget it. It'll be a touch point in all of our lives moving forward.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that these moments can have such power as touch points in terms of hopefully shifting thinking in terms of what do we intentionally leave behind and what do we need to take forward and what do we need to sort of create on the way through. And again, that's, for today, what we really want to then start diving into is looking, I guess, first to 2021 And it may seem for some that that's a pretty short focus, but in many ways it's important because we have the immediacy of the COVID normal, or the COVID economy, as we call it. And we've got to think about what do we need to understand to operate effectively, both at a personal level, in the organizational context or context we might be in the communities that we're a part of, and so on, in 2021, to get the best out of 2021, if you like, to be able to progress in some more powerful way in 2022 and beyond, and to deal with some of the other issues, which we'll come to a bit later, that we might also have to have in frame. But getting real about 2021, operating in 2021, and as you've said, COVID normal. I wanted to hit 4 points that you shared with me when we first met, and get you to share some insights and some thinking around what these mean from a vaccine perspective, because it seems pretty clear that part of what we're all counting on for COVID normal and beyond is, call it herd immunity in simple terms, but seeing vaccine as a key piece to that. So if we start maybe with the science piece, so what is your research gathering telling you about the science of vaccine, particularly given that we're chatting today, it's the 18th of November. We've had in the last week to maybe 10 days the news about Pfizer and their progress, AstraZeneca, et cetera, et cetera. So there's real energy around vaccine. But what's the truth, I think, that your research is showing behind maybe what we're hearing either from politics or through the media?
Yes. But before we skip on to that, a couple of quick points. I mentioned about looking back and settling into COVID normal, dealing with outbreaks, but I've also been encouraging my clients to look forward.
Right.
And in the COVID normal period, and this comes back to the science, I think we're looking at 2 to 5 years in COVID normal.
Yeah.
So even though the science is wonderful, and I truly, as you saw me clapping, congratulate our colleagues at Pfizer, Moderna, and all these other, from my alma mater, the University of Queensland, I understand there's more than 300 vaccine candidates in development at various points in time in the process. So we should congratulate these scientists. They've been working their tails off. They've been moved off other projects to put every bit of energy they possibly can into getting answers for us, not just vaccines, treatments, and education, preventative measures. There's lots of science going on. It's not just about,
of course, the
vaccine. But we'll come back to some of those a little bit later, I think. The Pfizer vaccine isn't without its problems. Now, first off, none of these vaccines have got approval.
Yeah.
With the possible exception of the Russian vaccine. Yeah, there's a bit of discussion about that too. None of them have been approved by anybody like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. And I used to import herbal products, so I know what an interesting group they are to deal with, and that nothing's quick with them.
Yeah.
They may grant emergency approval because of the public and government pressure. So I'm mentioning all this, that it's all very well for Pfizer to make an announcement to the stock exchange and see their shares go through the roof, which is understandable. But they still have 164 people to be exposed to COVID. And at last count, it was 90-something?
Yeah.
Something like that. So they've still got a fair bit of the trial to complete before they'll have a data set which can then be peer reviewed by a lot of other scientists who'll be very interested in their data.
Yeah.
And when they get through those scientific hoops, the peer review, then they've got the exciting experience of the approval process. Now, President Trump and others can sort of, and Boris Johnson, and they can wave their magic wand and say, approve it faster. But there are procedures, and they're about safety. So there's no shortcuts, in my view, for safety. So if you're at the TGA, FDA, or any of these other regulatory bodies, take your time. Do what's necessary, because the last thing in the world we need is to get a vaccine out there and have a whole lot of adverse reactions.
Yeah.
That won't help.
No.
Back to that later. There's already a significant group of anti-vaxxers out there, significant numbers of Australians. I was listening to Sharon Lewin the other night from the University of Melbourne, the Peter Doherty Institute, saying that in Australia the data indicates 20 to 30% of Australians will refuse the vaccine.
Right.
In New Zealand, it's 25%, and the data in the US is 50% or more will refuse the vaccine. That comes back to the herd immunity issue too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before we pass from science to manufacture and manufacture at scale, which is the next sort of big issue, sticking on the science, there is the question of herd immunity, and maybe if we could just talk about that for a moment,
Yes.
and also the question, I think that that many of us are aware that this is not the first coronavirus, and we don't have a great history in terms of developing a vaccine for prior coronaviruses, and certainly not, in my understanding anyway, where we've had some success, they're not vaccines that last for very long.
Well, and coming back to coronavirus, it was Peter Doherty, the Nobel laureate over whom that great institute has been named, that Sharon now heads. He was the one that pointed out the only corona vaccine that we've ever made for anything that worked was for chickens, not humans.
Right.
There are 4 coronaviruses, mild coronaviruses, that cause the common cold. And if you've ever had a common cold, you notice that we don't have a very good treatment. We certainly don't have a vaccine, and we're still stuck with, take a paracetamol, have a warm lemon drink and go to bed and just rest. That's not a particularly useful set of treatments for COVID, which is considerably more aggressive than coronavirus cold. We also have the majority of the common cold, by the way, is rhinoviruses, but there are some versions that are corona.
Yeah.
And of course, we had SARS, which brought me into the ampy space, which fortunately we got on top of very quickly, and the death rate was modest. And then we got MERS, which was a really alarming disease relating to camels. That kills a third of people that get it. Go and have MERS. So be careful if you go to the Middle East. Don't get pregnant with camels. And we've historically been persistently failing to develop coronavirus vaccines that work, as you pointed out correctly. So when there was all this excitement about, we'll have a vaccine, I went, oh, really? And for SARS-CoV-1, we tried to have a vaccine, and it was such a failure, it failed at the animal testing trials and was considered dangerous for humans. So you can see my point about safety.
Yeah.
So far, we've gone further through the process than we've ever done before with human coronavirus trials of vaccine. And we're still looking good, but it's still early days. The numbers are very small, and we haven't had a particularly strong history in this space. Now, coming back to herd immunity, which is another term that's been flashed about, again, back to this black swan, some people are very untidy. Herd immunity, well, let's think about measles. For instance, the measles vaccine, by the way, is now 98% effective. Now, that didn't happen overnight. That happened over years of getting better and better. We also have a herd immunity estimate globally of 95%. The World Health Organization is now talking about 70% herd immunity by vaccine for COVID. And Sharon was talking at a presentation with Dr. Fauci, Tony Fauci at the University of Melbourne, about 60 to 70%.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what we had hoped with COVID is that you would get the disease and you would recover and you would get immune. And other people would get the vaccine, and together that would create a herd immunity, which is what happens with measles. Unfortunately, the data for COVID indicates that the immunity does not last as long as we hoped. And some of the Chinese data, it's very short. And we now have over 20 well-documented cases globally where it appears people have got it twice.
Yep.
There's a D strain and a G strain. The current vaccines are on the D strain, and the G strain is the one that's hitting us hard in what's the so-called second wave globally.
Right.
So Our
It-
hope was that we would get well, immune, plus a vaccine, herd immunity. That's not going to happen.
Just on that D strain, G strain, are there any indications at this point about the current D strain vaccination focus, whether that will potentially likely translate to the G strain?
Yeah. The
Yeah.
evidence seems to be that won't be a particular problem.
Yeah. And my
There is a bit of good news. Coronavirus doesn't mutate as quickly as influenza virus.
Oh, that's good.
Good news.
And just quickly again, sorry, before we leave the science, just something else that has just popped into my head based on what you said earlier, and again, what we're seeing and hearing is the COVID long hauler question as well, which is in part about, I guess, long-term recovery, but there's also the uncertainty around, well, what about the long-term health impacts of a potentially compromised immune system, or immune system that's been triggered to behave maybe in a way that's different to what it might normally do. What are you seeing, thinking about, hearing in that space?
Well, and even the treatments that we've got for the severe end of COVID before you get to long COVID, dexamethasone and the like, that damages your immune system.
Yeah.
Save you, you have to suppress your immune system, and then how is that going to pan out for you in the long term?
Yeah.
So even if you don't get long haul COVID, but you have had dexamethasone, which is a steroid which is designed to reduce your normal immune function, what happens then?
Mm.
We do have some experience in dexamethasone for cancer and other treatments, but again, it's variable. There's a lot of individual differences. We just don't understand enough of the basic science. And for instance, if you think about the mumps vaccine, before COVID, it was considered the fastest vaccine development that we'd ever done in 3 to 4 years. And the scientists were thrilled about this. It's so good. But it was based on research that was dating back from World War II.
Yeah.
We had a body of scientific knowledge on which to build a very good vaccine. I was just listening to Professor Ian Fraser today talking about his wonderful work in the cervical cancer vaccine. I mean, he just didn't suddenly magically create the vaccine. It was built on solid science over many decades of our understanding of that terrible disease and its impact on women and obviously their families and loved ones. So we don't have that basic science for COVID, for SARS-CoV-2 to be more precise. We have some data from SARS-CoV-1, which was the so-called SARS outbreak of 2002-04. And it's interesting, I'm told by the scientists that the DNA testing between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 is about 80% the same virus. So these conspiracy theorists that say, oh, yes, we cooked it up in the laboratory, rah, rah, rah. No, there's so much evidence it's from a bat.
Yeah.
Now, how it came from the bat to the humans, we don't know. But it took almost a decade for us to be sure in the scientific papers that SARS-CoV-1 came bat to civet cat to humans.
Yeah.
At this point, we're fairly confident that it came bat to not sure how to humans.
Yeah.
And whether it was direct bat to humans or bat via something else, I know there's been a lot of mumbling about pangolins and all sorts of wonderful things. Again, it will probably be at least a decade based on how long it took us to sort out SARS-CoV-1 before we know what happened with SARS-CoV-2 in a reliable scientific basis that everyone can agree, yes, that's the data is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. So I think that gives us a pretty good picture of some basic scientific questions to really be asking, right? And I think for our audience, this is always about where can you dig further? What else do you need to understand to come to an informed view of what decisions you need to make in whatever disruption you're facing, right? This is an immediate global disruption that we've got to deal with, but the principles, if you like, apply. So with that is our first little bit of a deep dive. Take us down. What about manufacturing? And it's, to me, that's not about manufacturing at scale. So how many doses might we need of a a vaccine to get to 60 to 70%. And
yes, and
where
that's
can we make it?
globally, by the way. We're
Yes,
not just
yeah.
talking about Australia, because as Christopher Pine and others have pointed out, if anyone has it, we've all got a problem. We can't take the chance
Yeah.
of spreading from another country. You'll notice our problems in Australia have largely been from returning travellers. That's not to suggest for a moment that we should abandon Australians and say, bad luck, you just can die. That's unforgivable. And that's certainly not the Australian way. And as I discovered when I worked on the Indian Ocean tsunami data, about 1 million, well, before COVID, at any one time, we have about 1 million Australians offshore.
Mm.
They're either there for leisure or work or relatives or whatever it is they might be up to. And this became an issue when we were considering how many people might have been impacted by the Indian Ocean tsunami. So it's obviously relevant for COVID when we're trying to bring people back. Now, the last figure I saw was something like 27,000 Australians were still registered to return. Now, as those numbers and the COVID problems in other countries start to become more of a problem, that 27,000 figure might get a bit bigger.
Yes, yeah.
And at present, I think we're bringing something 500-ish, maybe a few more, into the country. Well, it's going to take us a while.
Yeah. I think we're gradually increasing the numbers, but the point is an important one, isn't it? That the global manufacture, and then we'll get to the distribution question in a sec as well. But coming back to manufacturing.
Yes, coming back to manufacturing. We do have a small capacity in Australia. According to Wikipedia, there are 35 vaccine manufacturers in the world. They don't even include CSL. We're so small, not worth mentioning, which is bad luck for us, but good luck, because they started on Monday, reportedly, manufacturing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine.
Okay.
Now, of course, it hasn't finished its trials, so it's a bit of a risk. They could be manufacturing a lot of vaccine that's got to go in the rubbish tin, but we're hopeful that the answer is it does work. The so-called Pfizer vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine, is new technology.
Okay.
The first of its kind. We've never created that kind of vaccine using that sort of platform. It's all new science. And in Australia at the University of Queensland, they're working on a molecular clamp vaccine, again, new technology. However, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is more a traditional vaccine. So we do have the capacity in Australia to make some of it.
Yeah.
The Pfizer vaccine we cannot make in Australia, to the best of my understanding, because it needs to be maintained at, wait for this, minus 70 degrees Celsius, minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mm.
Now, unless we can find some magical way to make it here in Australia, we'll have to import it.
Yeah.
Now, that creates another problem, and I'll come back to that with supply chain, but let's just have a little glimpse on that. Most aircraft that come into Australia, at least some of them have the capacity to bring what's called chill cold chain, which is +2 to +8 degrees, which is how most vaccines come.
Yeah.
They're chilled. This Pfizer vaccine is what's called frozen. It's not cryogenic. That's even worse.
Yeah.
The scientists decided to make it cryogenic. So we do have that other little problem. But coming back to who would manufacture it, and we'll come back to supply chain next. The largest vaccine manufacturer in the world that I've been able to identify is called the Serum Institute of India.
Mm-hmm.
According again to Wikipedia, public sources. So I'm trying to make sure I'm pointing your listeners to something they can find, nothing that's a state secret.
Yeah.
It's all public. Again, according to Wikipedia, the Serum Institute of India makes the most vaccines by doses in the world. They already have agreements in place with Oxford AstraZeneca, Novavax and Codagenics. Because they're a listed company, they have to actually announce these.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit like what the Australian government has done, where they've got these pre-manufacture agreements, where they said, we'll give you some money in the hope that this vaccine works,
Yeah.
you can go and do more research and make more of it and give it to us for a very good deal. So it's sort of like advance purchase of shares
Yeah.
or insurance. We're hoping, we're betting that some of these vaccines we've invested in will work.
And then I presume that the sort of let's start making some of it now is, again, it's a bit of a hedge that it will, so that when we get the tick yes go, we're not then starting to make, we've actually got some supply which can start to be shifted
Yes.
around and given in whatever priority will be determined, whether it's those who are most vulnerable or health professionals or whatever that might be.
Yes, and I've uncovered some interesting prioritization tables from our American friends.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure my replacement colleagues have been doing similar in Australia, but just haven't made them public yet. And the American ones, Governor Cuomo for the New York State has kindly made his prioritisation tables public.
Ah.
Now, I would have no reason to believe that other countries or other states wouldn't have similar prioritisation tables. And he kicks off with the obvious people. Healthcare, frontline workers get the first about 3% of vaccinations. Nobody would disagree.
No.
There's been a horrendous death toll in medical workers and illness. It's just been catastrophic. Once upon a time, my husband and I used to go to Italy for 6 weeks every year. We've just sat in horror watching the death toll and the loss, particularly of the medical workers there. It's just been terrifying to see how many of them have been lost. And until the vaccine starts to roll out for them, because it appears to be a sort of dosage thing. The more exposure you have to it, regardless of how good your PPE is, how good your procedures are, if you just get exposed to a lot of the virus, it seems there's no saving you.
Yeah.
So the sooner we get the vaccines to those people, whether it's Pfizer, Oxford AstraZeneca, Moderna, Cotogenics, which is a nasal spray type thing.
Oh, interesting.
A bit different.
Yeah.
They have to be first cab off the rank, because not only do they need to protect us from COVID, they need to protect us from everything else. You know, we haven't having car accidents, which I used to investigate a lot in the police, or any of the other adverse things or good things like having a baby.
Yeah.
You want some medical workers for those to be helpful.
Sure do.
With COVID, that doesn't help us at all. Then the next trench is sort of other helpful people like police, fire, truck drivers, people involved with food supply chain.
Yeah.
Then the next trench is the obvious people over 65 who have been seriously overrepresented in the death rates, or people with other conditions like my sister, who's had a lifetime of asthma. She'd be a phase 3 person. Phase 4 is other critical workers, and phase 5 is everybody else.
Yeah.
A chance. Now, the reason why I mapped that out is you don't need to be very scientific or mathematically minded to realise that that's 5 phases. It's a lot of manufacturing. It's going to take a long time. This happens for us.
Yep.
And furthermore, we've got to think of it in the global context, coming back to that herd immunity. The World Health Organization estimates they want 70% vaccinated. The current global population is 7.8 billion. 70% is 5.46 billion.
Yep.
If it's the Pfizer vaccine, you need it twice, about 3 weeks apart.
Okay.
So that's 5.46 billion by 2.
Yep.
If you listen to the World Health Organization again, the majority of about 50% of vaccines get damaged in transit for their child vaccination program. If you look at IATA, which is the International Aviation Transport Agency, they support that view. About 50% gets damaged on aircraft or airports. So have to make double.
So your 2 to 5 year analysis of COVID normal is really about learning to live with the ups and downs of active virus, because it's, excuse me, quite realistic that we're not going to have 70% of the world's population vaccinated, inside of that sort of time frame. In a perfect world, yet maybe within the next 2 years, but in a real world, more likely 5.
And one of my colleagues on the Global Supply Chain Council thinks I'm being overly optimistic and should be making a 10-year horizon before we're looking at post-COVID.
Right.
So even 2 to 5 years, which we think seems reasonable, thinks is optimistic.
Yeah. So let's a little bit. You've given us a good insight to that supply chain question. Is really about temperature and what the viability, I guess, of vaccine through that transport journey. The last piece, then, and maybe this is the most challenging to a certain extent because this is where the human condition gets involved. That's actually shifting, in your words, from vaccine to vaccination, which is, getting people to do the nasal spray or line up to get jabbed in the arm or whatever it might be. And you've already, referred to anti-vaxxers and questions about our ability to do this at scale, et cetera. But maybe just, again, go into a bit of some of the key things to be thinking about around vaccination.
I can understand people's hesitation. These vaccines have been produced at warp speed, to quote President. We have never made vaccines faster. Remember my mum's example? We did that in 3 to 4 years. That was considered super fast. So the safety trials will be quite limited, the safety information, because there'll be a limited number of trial subjects, there'll be a limited exposure, there'll be limited time. How long have they been exposed? With long COVID, we don't know whether the vaccine might suddenly trigger a problem sometime later. We don't know because we haven't had that time scale to see. So the early recipients of the vaccines will continue effectively to be trial subjects. If you think about it, will be closely monitored. So even if the TGA gives it the tick, so gives Pfizer, Moderna and anything else that comes along the tick on an emergency approval basis, they will be very closely monitoring for adverse reactions. Now, this has also been an unusual vaccine. Most vaccines are tested on men. For a long time, they were never tested on women. They just hoped they worked on us too. Because we were held to have a confusing and complex physiology. Oh, isn't that nice? Anyway, let's try and avoid the sexism of vaccines.
Yes.
That's the way it used to be. Whereas the World Health Organization is much less forgiving this time. Not only do they want vaccines tested on those inconvenient creatures, women, they also want it tested on children and older people.
Right.
Before they're going to give it their approval ticks. So that's also pushing out the trials. But there's very good reasons why they want it tested on children, because we're suspicious that they might be super spreaders, asymptomatic spreaders. And in the case of the older people, well, we know only too well with the sad story of aged care in Victoria that people of a certain age are incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah. So
I can see the anti-vaxxers' point of view. They're not being unrealistic. But as Dr. Fauci put it in his remarks to the University of Melbourne last month, what he hopes will happen is as more people have had the vaccination and not had adverse reactions, and over time, people may see, well, okay, maybe I can give it a go too. So people who don't necessarily have a kind of philosophical anti-vax approach, but are just cautious people, waiting and seeing, and again, I can understand that, maybe holding off, just waiting and seeing a few more people having it and how's it going. And actually, as they see over coming months, possibly years, that there are less adverse reactions, that perhaps more of their friends have had it and they seem fine, or it might be like the flu shot. A lot of people say, oh, I feel a bit poorly the next couple of days. Okay. It's fine. They might be willing to tolerate, I have it and maybe have it on a Thursday and take a couple of days off so I'm fine by Monday, that kind of thing. You might discover that kind of pattern, which is not unknown. I remember my first and late husband was in the Navy, and they used to give them all these vaccines at once before they went overseas. And then they were pretty ragged after all of that. They had all their adverse reactions together.
Oh, at the same time. That does make me think of one last quick question on vaccine. Then I want to get into implications for the last bit of our conversation. But back to the supply chain and logistics question, do we have any insight yet as to viability? Because I know with some vaccines you can only have them for a certain amount of time before they're unviable anyway. So you sometimes, you go, I'm going to book in for my flu shot, and it's like, well, we just don't have it at the moment because either we've run out or we're waiting for the next batch, etc. So it's not just I think sometimes we think, oh, it's large scale distribution, but then it's the micro channels of getting, we're in semi-regional Victoria, is it going to be the local GP that has it and getting it to service the 3,500 to 5,000 people in this bit of the world who may or may not get it, and so on. But just back to that, do we have any insight around length of time with which the vaccines that they're producing might remain viable?
The data on Pfizer says 10 days.
From manufacture to injection?
Yes. We don't know the data on the Moderna yet.
Yeah.
But what I've read is the Pfizer says 10 days from them making it in their high-performance laboratories in Germany and the United States to it must be here and in your arm. 10 days.
And got to be kept at minus 70 degrees the whole way through.
Yes. If that ultra cold chain breaks down, the vaccine isn't viable.
Well, now I think that gives us a pretty clear picture of some of the challenges that we face. And then for what we think about, and for the audience, that they're obviously the people who listen to Straight Talk in the COVID economy are human beings, and there are personal implications for all of the things that we've been exploring. There are business implications for the roles that they have, the leadership decisions they may have to make. And of course, many people also wear multiple hats and are in communities and so on. But when you're working with your client organizations and thinking, what does this mean, say, for 2021 in terms of operating smartly, if you like, in this part of COVID normal, what are you seeing as some considerations that people really should be taking into account?
Well, many of my colleagues and I have been inviting clients to do what's called a post-incident review. So even though the pandemic isn't over, let's look back, see if there's anything to bring forward. Let's look at how we've moved into a COVID normal, settled in. For instance, one of my clients has provided a service face-to-face for their clients always. That was been their operating model.
Yeah.
Not anymore. It's all online. But even when they start to move out of the extreme COVID restrictions, for want of a better term, they're going to have a hybrid model where they'll offer clients a face-to-face service for some functions if the client would like that, or an online service. And some of these services are provided in more remote and smaller communities, in which case for privacy, the clients actually quite like it. And you're talking about being in Victoria, long distances, so less travel, better privacy, particularly, what small communities are like.
Yeah.
Especially if you have any sort of health problems, which is the services provided by this client. So the clients have accepted the hybrid model very well, but some of the practitioners have struggled a bit more. So I think one of the things that I'm encouraging employers to be is patient.
Yep.
Because there's quite a lot of evidence. I saw a LinkedIn poll where 67% of people don't want to go back to work. They don't want to go back to a fixed workplace, ever. Now, I was working remotely before COVID came along, and I can tell you I really love it. I love remote working. It's not that I'm an antisocial person. You might have guessed that I do like people, but I also like quiet, so I get my work done. I get a lot more done in 4 hours sitting here in my little laptop than I do in an office with distractions, noisiness. And so there's some people that have discovered you're actually more productive. For a smaller number of hours, they can get more done because they don't get distracted. But then there's the issue of trust. A number of my colleagues have pointed that out, that some employers are struggling with that. Can they trust their employees to deliver when they're not watching over them? So there's all these questions about traditional business models.
Mm-hmm.
And that came up in yesterday's Prime get-together.
Yeah.
Will it be about deliverables or will it be about time served?
Yes, which is a challenge, but an opportunity as well. What about agility in 2021? You know, I think, or I wonder if people feel like, oh, we're going to settle into COVID normal and we'll be able to just kind of, it'll be different, but we'll be able to roll on and we won't have the sort of disruption like we had sort of from March onwards. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, we've seen what's happened in Adelaide over the last couple of days. So are we going to need to be in this kind of be patient and also be consciously ready to flex at any moment in time? Is that part of what you're seeing as well?
And that's why I've been encouraging people to plan for 5 years plus. What will COVID look like? How can you position yourself? So even businesses that have appeared to do really well during COVID period, so take couriers. We seem to have developed a great taste for online shopping.
Yep.
There's hardly a day at our little cottage by the sea that someone doesn't deliver something. My thirsty husband with his ever-growing wine collection, or something, a book for me or something. But for instance, in Wuhan, when they found themselves in that severe lockdown they had quite early in February, they actually started experimenting with robot couriers. So they would send you a text message saying, we will alert you when your package is coming. And then they would sort of maneuver their little robot courier device down the highways, which were empty, stop at your apartment, send you a text message with a code. You go downstairs, type your code in, up pops the lid, you get your little package out, you go back and you've got your whatever it is. But even before this in Canberra, which is where I'm normally based, we were working with Amazon testing drone deliveries of small packages for them. So, and a number of CTOs, Chief Technology, Chief Information Officers, have been telling me that they brought forward their 5-year plan. A whole lot of things that they were going to do progressively all of a sudden became now. So they have to start replanning what the 5 years is.
Yeah, and I guess that replanning is often new. If you bring forward what you're going to do over 5 years and you do it in a year, then you've got a new baseline capability set to work from in terms of what's possible next as well. So being quite strategic about what are the capabilities you build in 2021, with a view that that's not just about 2021. It's about what does that enable you to do next, I would suggest becomes an important part of thinking how you best operate next year.
Absolutely. But coming back to your staff, I think this whole issue of trust and mental health, people have been incredibly scared. So don't underestimate the damage that this has done to people's mental health. They've been scared for their jobs. They've been scared for their health. They've been scared for their lives. And in my case, I've been frequently fretting about my aging parents. My father lives in an aged care facility.
Yes, I can relate to that. My mum lives in America.
So even if you're not fretting about yourself, you're fretting about other loved ones, which is a significant distraction, and it's hard to set that aside. And this could be an issue for all of your employees. So that was my point about, be a bit patient with them. But I think if you're patient with them, you'll be rewarded. And that's the other thing I've been looking at. So some employers, back to the point that people are quite uneasy about returning to a fixed workplace. And I came across an employer that, a service provider that makes videos for employers to welcome people back to the office. So they show them things like, you don't have to touch your security pass anymore. It's magnetized, so you'll just slide straight through. The lift buttons, we're providing sanitized wipes for you at the lift foyers. You can use those to press the buttons, touch things. When you get out, there's a nice bin that you foot operate, drop the thing in, off you go. You will see more daytime cleaning
Yep.
in shared spaces like kitchens and bathrooms. All sorts of things. You will see the 4 meters. We measured it all out for your safety, or we've got perspex screens, or we've done this, and we've done that. Another major employer, I won't mention their name, it's a name you all recognise, actually calculated that if everybody came back to the office in their Melbourne headquarters and had the 1.5 metre spacing, and they all turned up at 9 o'clock, the queue would be more than 1.5 kilometres down the road. No.
So you've got to be very proactive on understanding that quite likely for somewhere for the next 2 to 5 years, the fundamental way that you operate is going to be different. So
Yes.
Forward think things like who needs to be in the office when, what do they do that's most productive in that time? How do we make sure not everybody descends on us all at once? So clear, communication and tools to enable that. Be conscious about what you bring forward, and be thoughtful in a way about what I heard in the robot delivery is that those are experiments that you can do in real time to learn about what's possible. Because we all know that autonomous, semi-autonomous delivery of parcels is part of what may emerge sometime, maybe sooner than we think. But I suspect if we haven't done some of those experiments in Australia, we will be a bit behind the game when that technology matures and arrives and is, ready to go. Which again, from a disruption perspective, for those courier businesses that maybe have grown in COVID, particularly in this first year, if they're not looking at their future capability sets, then they might find themselves behind the 8 ball when the next wave of change sort of washes over us. So just as a final sort of closing couple of thoughts from you, and I am conscious of respecting your time as well. We've talked a lot about virus and science and vaccine and manufacture and distribution, all that sort of stuff, to really reinforce that there isn't any going back, there's only going forward, and that we need to start sort of embracing that mindset, which is be prepared for a longer journey to post-COVID. So understand that COVID normal is going to be longer than maybe we hope for or think.
Yes.
Stepping just briefly beyond that, because I think there's a whole another conversation we could have at another time, but just a couple of insights. What else are you thinking about in COVID normal? What are some other issues that we might want our listeners to be, again, avenues for interrogation? Think more about, these 3, 4, 5. What are some other things to really start thinking about?
Well, COVID plus, we're in the traditional disaster season.
Yeah.
So things like floods, fires, cyber attack, whatever the hell.
Yeah.
Now, this is Australia. We seem to have everything. Lucky us. They're not going away. So you need to be thinking about your business continuity plans, your emergency plans in terms of COVID plus fire, for instance. So, for instance, the New South Wales RFS has been practicing COVID-safe backburning.
Yep.
So that when they actually have to go out there and, fight fires for real, they've already worked out how to sort of keep a bit further apart than they used to, wear masks more, all sorts of things, have their food delivered in a different way or packaged up. A whole lot of things that they have to do differently to keep their team safe. Obviously, we need to keep our firefighters in the best possible condition. There's not a lot of them, and we may need them again. Or the SES if we have floods and so on. But the same thing applies to your business. Look at your business continuity plans in terms of COVID plus, whatever you might have seen as additional threats to your business. So it'd be very remiss of me not to encourage you to do that, because you probably wrote those plans before COVID. And as you pointed out, you've got this COVID normal, which has changed a whole lot of things. Even simple things like in Canberra for a while, we allowed 50%, up to 50% back in the office. Did that include your fire wardens, your first aid officers?
Yep. So you've really got to understand how to organize and operate, thinking about all the things you thought of, but also letting go of the way we did it pre-COVID, invent it for COVID normal, if you like, and then use that to take forward what else might be possible from there.
Well, one of my clients, fortunately, is a small enterprise. They had a fire evacuation recently and they had one fire warden for 45 staff.
Right.
Not enough. So they've decided that they're going to train everyone. Anyone that would like to train as a fire warden, be our guest.
Yep.
We will fund you this additional set of skills. And when you train as a fire warden, you get to do all sorts of exciting things like learn to use fire extinguishers and fire blankets, things that are actually quite helpful for you personally. So they're selling it to their staff is this won't just protect you at the office, it'll be helpful for you at home if you should have a fire or a problem.
Yeah.
So that way they'll never be short of a warden again.
Yeah. So it's a bit of distributing capabilities in new ways. Yeah. And also leveraging the opportunity here for people to build new skills and to take those forward into COVID normal and beyond. So,
and what we're seeing in overseas, for instance, Barclays Bank is looking at rotating staff through. You'll get a period of time in the headquarters office and a period of time working remotely. And in between, there'll be a deep clean. So they'll basically shut the office between Friday 6 o'clock and Monday 8 o'clock. And in between, deep cleaning will proceed. And then the other team can come in. So that sort of thing where you get a little bit of working remotely and a little bit of working in the office. And as the head of Barclays Bank, they're not exactly known from being a mob of radicals, are they? Back in April was saying that he could save himself about half his fixed office space by this model. Now, that was with a model of a third of his people in at a time, a third at his alternate site and a third working remotely. Now, the reason why I said a half is because he has to space his staff out more.
Yeah.
So it's a matter about thinking about this. For instance, I understand Google's told their people for the next 2 years they're not coming into the office.
Yeah.
They'll come in for a quarterly event. That's it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were part of the conversation we had with Mark Zawacki yesterday, and that's a previous interview we've done as part of Straight Talking the COVID Economy. But, one of the concepts Mark put to the group was the idea of shifting from off-sites to on-sites, so the old, everybody's in the office and then we go off-site to do something. It might be more that everybody's working remotely or in some sort of hybrid model, and we deliberately plan an on-site to do what it is that we might have done in the old off-site model, which is an interesting twist on not having to sort of radically reinvent, but, taking something and refreshing it and thinking about how it works differently in COVID normal.
Well, there could be some real savings here too. If you, so in the case of the head of Barclays Bank, he was talking about reducing his expensive Canary Walk office space, London office space. God only knows what the square foot cost of those places would be, but I reckon it wouldn't be cheap.
Yeah, so a client of ours rang us about, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time in terms of when Australia really started to go into lockdown. He said, I just wanted to let you know that we had everybody ready to work remotely in early February. We were working remotely by late Feb, and I've just done the maths and worked out I've saved myself an awful lot in future costs in terms of office space. And he won't be alone. There'll be lots and lots of organizations doing exactly those sort of calculations. How do we get best value for whatever our investments may be, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's people capability, the technologies to support that, and so on. And for us, as you're coming to know us, Chris, this is always about the possibility that emerges when you think about how do we leverage disruption, through a change ahead of change mindset, to genuinely release, rethink, and reinvent based on, what is always a mix of opportunity and risk. Every risk is an opportunity, every opportunity is a risk, but really thinking how we leverage something like COVID, acknowledging that part of that is about getting better in terms of preparedness around something like pandemic so we don't go to sleep, on what is coming next. And we don't discount the human lives that have been impacted, but we also use this as a hopefully a moment of learning to take us all forward. So with that as a bit of a wrap, and again, respectful of your time, I just want to say an enormous thank you from ourselves here at Resilient Futures, from the team that produces Straight Talk in the COVID Economy, Jess and Theo, who are madly working away in the background to make all of this sort of stuff happen. And of course, particularly to our Resilient Futures Network Prime members, one of the things that we are going to be doing more and more is inviting Prime members to share their stories and their insights and their experiences. So we'll have this nice mix of folks like Mark Zawacki and Rebecca Costa, who are these big sort of global experts on a particular slice of the world. But equally in the Prime Network, we have people who have great expertise that they've built over a long career of doing things like you have in the business continuity space. So thank you on behalf of our audience for sharing a bit about your journey, and then for doing a deep dive into Let's Get Real when we're talking straight in the COVID economy about all that we have to understand around vaccine and vaccination to shape part of the picture about how we look to operating in 2021 and beyond. So a huge thank you from us, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to future conversations.
Thanks very much, David. It was my pleasure to offer a few ideas for your listeners. Thank you.
Brilliant.
We hope you've enjoyed this Straight Talk in the COVID Economy podcast. Thank you for listening. And please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. For more free content that will enhance your understanding of this new COVID economy and the actions that you can take to leverage disruptive change, join the Resilient Futures Network at www.resilientfutures.com/get-started. And please support our partner, Impact Africa Network, at www.impactafrica.network. We need all the support we can to help them build their own incubator. We know that there are many other great podcasts out there, and your time is precious, and you chose to listen to Straight Talk in the COVID Economy. And we appreciate that. Thank you.